Hello and welcome to the Modern Music Mixing course. Here we're going to be working on drums. Let's get into the session. Right, so the first thing I want us to look at is essentially what we're going to start with and what we're going to end up with. So here is the drums completely unprocessed, and then at random points I'll all of these plugins on and switch them back. And now you can basically gauge what we're going to start with and what we're going to end up with. So you can hear it's overall a less boxy sound. We've also got more point and snap on the snare. You just hear that snare coming through now. Got a little bit more sizzle on the top as well. You can hear that in the hi-hats and the cymbals and also the snare drum. Right, so let's start with this drum bus. First thing we've got is an equalizer. Let's take a listen to what this is doing for us. So much tighter sound, as you can hear. A lot of that I think will be attributed to this. And also these quite broad moves here. Right, so let's actually break this down now. We'll start with the low shelf here. So if you've got headphones on or a good system, you should be able to hear this. That's sort of like the thump and the snare drum that we're bringing out a little bit more. Next we're going to move to this little dip here around 500 Hz. So you can hear that's where all the boxy energy is in this drum take. Or this drum recording, I should say. Next we have this quite wide sort of area here where the, what would you call it, the treble area is. So that's bringing out, the snare drum quite nicely there. Also a little bit of that point on the kick drum as well, so we get a little bit more of that coming through in the mix. And then we have this high shelf here. Well, it's actually a big wide EQ, but it's basically a high shelf. So bringing out the top end of the snare drum and of course the hi-hats and cymbals and the actual beta sound of the kick drum. So one more time in bypass. Yeah, you can just see all that boxiness come in as soon as we bypass the EQ. Or you can hear that point come out on the snare straight away as well. Right, let's go to what we're doing with the virtual mix rack here. So we have a trimmer which isn't doing anything, so we can actually get rid of that. And then we're going into the virtual mix bus, Brit 4KE, and then FG stress. So let's just bypass the FG stress for now, and we'll concentrate on what we're doing with the virtual mix bus. Currently in bypass by this here. Oh yeah. can really hear the kick drum pushing into that saturator there. It's just gluing the kick into the rest of the drum tracks quite nicely. You can hear a little bit of colour coming from the snare drum as well as it pushes into that sort of the non-linearities of the mix bus. Now let's take a listen to what the FG Stress is doing. Now one thing, I'll just take this off for a second. One thing you may notice is that we're using a ratio of 1:1, so maybe you can guess what we're actually using the FG Stress for. Let's take a listen. So hopefully what you could hear was the FG Stress is just giving us a little bit of subtle fattening. Now let's talk about why it's doing that. We've got the ratio set to 1:1, which basically means it's not doing any compression. But the FG Stress is it's meant to be a faithful model of the stress, the distressor, the very sought after compressor that you can get your hands on for a couple of grand. So it's meant to be a faithful model of that. Whether it is or it isn't doesn't concern me, to be honest with you. What does concern me is the fact that in here, as the audio signal comes through this plugin, it's going to add that harmonic colour into our drum bus, and it does it even when you haven't got this switched in, but if you use distortion too, it's going to give us more even harmonics than odd harmonics. So as we drive this harder, you're going to get more even harmonic generation from the signal that you push into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to demonstrate this using the input-output. If you hold shift and click, it will simultaneously move the input and output together so that you keep a roughly same volume. And what you should hear is that you'll hear the drum start to become crushed by the saturation itself of the model and not the compression. So let's take a listen to that now. So you can hear a lot of distortion there. And as I ease it back, it cleans up. So that's how we're using the FG Stress in this instance. We're not using it as a compressor, we're using it as a saturator because it has some really nice saturation. It has a nice saturation profile that I wanted to use on the drums. The next thing we are going into is another saturator. It's the virtual tape machine. Something that I like using a lot of. Before I take it out bypass, you can see we're using a -2 dB of bass alignments. Got the noise reduction all the way down -80 and no wow and flutter. We're in bypass right now. Yeah, so you can really hear it glue together, that drum bus, quite nicely. You can hear the kick drum pressing into the tape machine here. Also the snare drum, you can hear it just tucking that snare drum in just a little bit. So here, the saturation is almost working like a compressor. As the kick drum pushes into it, it just holds it back a little bit. As the snare drum pushes into it, it holds it back a little bit. So that's essentially our drum bus. Let's actually go through all of these together. And we'll bypass these and bring them in and out, essentially, just to show what they do. So no processing. So again, straight away you can hear that boxiness and that undefined drum sound come in as soon as we take it out of bypass. More glued together, more impact in the low end, and that top end shelf is just bringing out that detail just a little bit. Right, so next thing I'm going to listen to is the kick drum. We've currently got it soloed. We're going to listen to it in solo just to get a feel for what the kick drum sounds like, and then we'll put it in with the rest of the drum track. A really nice, crisp kick drum, and this is what we're going to do to it. We have something here, but we're not going to go over this in this episode. Right, okay. Let's actually listen to that with the entire drum track now. To go over what we're actually doing. So we have this EQ here. Let's take a listen to it and we will bring it in and out. Okay, so there's a few things going on here. The first thing we're doing is we've got this a high pass here, and it's at 27.5 hertz, so it's very, very low. I think all we're doing there is just getting rid of just a tiny little bit of rumble, that sub-rumble in the kick drum, that little bit of noise, and whilst it may sound a little bit counterintuitive for the low end of the kick drum, I think to a certain extent you do have to balance, you know, how much sub you want with how much headroom that takes up. And I think quite often you can make a kick drum sound a little bit more defined in the sub low end area when you use a high pass. So that's sort of 27 hertz. You know, you've got tons of information still at like 30 hertz, 40 hertz. So lots of low end there. But except I think it's going to be a little bit more defined with the high pass for me personally. Now, next thing we have is this low shelf, which is only like half a decibel. Let's take a listen to what we're boosting here. And in fact, I'm just going to unsolo the drums and solo the kick drum. There we go. So let's take a listen to this low shelf and what it's doing. So very subtle boost on the thump end of the kick drum. And here we're adding some focus to the 120 hertz area of that low end. So that's quite important for systems with smaller speakers. So for instance, if you're listening to this song on the television and you haven't got the television hooked up to some nice speakers, or you're listening to it on basically anything with a small speaker system, having a little bit of points at that 120 hertz might just help us get a little bit of that thump of the kick drum coming through. Because anything under, say, 90, 80 hertz with small speakers, you've pretty much got no chance of that coming through. So we're just trying to add a little bit of point there just so that we're catering for people with smaller speakers, basically. Now, the next thing we've done is we've got this quite large band here. You can basically think of it as a low shelf. It's not, it's actually an EQ band, as you can see. Let me just put that back where it was. What this is essentially doing is just softening up the actual beta sound. So if I just solo this band and we'll take a listen to what information is there. So for a sort of pop mix, and I'm going to put this back in with the entire drum track now. For a pop mix, I don't think a lot of points on the kick drums usually needed. If it's a metal mix, especially if you've got that double beta technique going on, you know, yeah, you're going to bring some of that information out just so you can hear what the drummer's doing, especially in the dense mix where you need that beta sound to actually come through. But for this pop mix, I wanted the kick to be a little bit more softer, a little bit, less aggressive. And it was already quite pointy with, the natural sample that we're using here on the drums. So we're just softening that up a little bit, basically. Next, what have we got? We have the virtual mix rack, and we have the VCC channel New York, and also the bomber. Let's just take these out for a second. Once again, we have the trimmer doing nothing. So get rid of that. So first thing we have is the VCC using the Brit 4KE. Let's have this bypassed and we'll bring it back in and hear the effect it's having on the kick drum. Just adding a little bit more density there on the low end of the kick. Let's just solo it and bypass it just so you can get a real good feel for what it's doing. So you can actually hear that little bit of saturation coming through there. Just thickening up the kick drum. Okay, we'll do it with the rest of the drum bus again, and we'll take a listen to what the New York is doing. Again, just thickening it up again. Let's actually focus on what the bomber's going to do now. So it's kind of tightening it up. As you can hear, it's kind of allowing the initial transient through, and then it's snapping down on the sustain part of that signal. So you're getting a very tight kick drum sound from the FG bomber. Just take a listen. So this is with it in and bypassed. Hopefully you can hear that. I'll just increase the intensity just to really drive home the points. So hopefully you could hear there the sort of effect that the FG bomber is having. It's essentially operating like a transient shaper where you bring down the sustain part of the signal.